Tapu fam, peace and blessings. This is Derric RauKhu Moore, and in this video I wanted to talk about the difference between what I think is the difference between honoring, venerating, and worshiping the ancestors. I think that one of the first things that people need to understand when it comes to working with the ancestors is that this is not a practice that just sprung up in the past 20 or 40 years. Working with the ancestors has been around for thousands and thousands of years, and it has been practiced by humanity all over the world. To truly understand what it means to honor, venerate, and worship the ancestors, imagine that thousands of years ago, when the first human beings walked the planet, they were hunters and gatherers. These ancient hunters and gatherers had to learn how to cooperate with one another and collectively defend themselves against the elements of nature and the ferocious animals who preyed upon them. The eldest among these ancient dwellers were most likely prized for their wisdom, for they knew the best way to track an animal down for its meat. The elders were also prized for their wisdom because they knew the best herbs that could be used to relieve specific ailments and pains. I imagine that when death came like a thief in the night and stole away their elders, the first people did not know what to expect. All they knew was that the warm smile, the generous and elderly person they loved, was now gone, and left in its place was a cold and hollow shell. I imagine at the time death was seen by early men and women as a great enemy, because not only did it take their deceased loved ones away, it robbed the family, the clan, and the entire tribal community of their elders' wisdom. So the practice of honoring their deceased loved ones developed because the early people missed and longed for their loved ones to return and share their wisdom again. In time, I imagine that early people began to accept that death was a way of life and look for ways to prepare for its return. They could not fight death, but they could prepare their elders and the community by having the elders teach the youth their wisdom, thus creating a circuit and a powerful bond that tied the elders with the youth. This time when death stole their elders, they were not at a complete loss because the wisdom and memories of their elders had been disseminated to all within the community. Thus began the veneration of the dead. I imagine that in time, one of the hunter-gatherers began to ponder on the origin of the ancestors and the origin of life itself. This ancient philosopher eventually concluded that there was a supreme being who created all things. Thus, it was the source of all things and all the attributes of the ancestors possessed. thereby making the divine, the supreme being, the first ancestor of all people. In other words, the divine exists within all of us. But since the divine is abstract and incomprehensible, to symbolize the divine, the image of an ancestor was taken. Thus began ancestor worship.
So we see that there is a marginal difference between honoring, venerating, and worshiping the ancestors. Just to recap, honoring refers to remembering your ancestors. Okay. Venerating refers to actually paying respect to your ancestors, whereas worship is basically the continual practice of both, in which you're trying to go ahead and basically bring a certain attribute or virtues that ancestor represented. You want to bring those into your life. Okay. Now, that being said, I honor my ancestors, okay, but I would not venerate all of my ancestors. All right. Now, the reason is because some of my ancestors, they were involved in some very unscrupulous activities, and they did some things that I thought was totally unacceptable before they transitioned. It's not that they were necessarily bad people per se. It's just that there were some things that they did, some of the choices that they made that I just really didn't agree with. Okay, so I wouldn't venerate them. However, I might honor them, but I won't venerate them. Okay. In fact, I think that most of us in the West, we do not have actual ancestors that we would venerate or hold in high regards, because basically, for the most part, slavery went ahead and disrupted our ancestral way. Okay, so this is why spirit guides exist. This is why we honor spirit guides in their place. Okay, think about spirit guides. Spirit guides can be historical ancestors. They can be mythical ancestors. They can be cultural ancestors. Okay, for instance, Malcolm X, all right, is not biologically related to me, all right, but he is someone whom I can model. He is someone that I have respect for. Okay, he is also someone in the ancestral realm that my ancestors can also relate and identify with. Okay, the reason you want to know the difference between honoring and venerating your ancestors is because when it comes to actually getting into the worship, the continual practice of it, you don't want to engage in a practice that is constantly honoring or venerating the wrong ancestral energies. Okay. If you understand what I mean by that, okay, you will see that there is no way someone who alleges to be all about the ancestors, they can engage in unethical, animalistic, perverted behavior, okay, unless they are venerating the wrong ancestors, or they're venerating ancestors who should not be venerated and should just be honored. Okay. Remember, I stated in the beginning, working with the ancestors is the first and one of the oldest spiritual practices in the world. Okay. This is a spiritual practice that has been practiced by humanity all over the world. Okay. So what that means is, being a spiritual practice, it means that you should be, or you're supposed to be, spiritually evolving, spiritually growing. So if you're not growing, meaning you're not being challenged to come out of your box, to come out of your comfort zone and learn a new way of doing things, learn a new way to improve your life, then you're cherry picking on your spiritual development, which is not how venerated ancestors, that's not how they roll. To put it in perspective, pour libations to Pookie, who just used to, who basically ran the block and was a stick-up kid, that's not the same as pouring libations to Malcolm X. You get what I'm saying? Okay. Pookie was all about himself. That's the big difference. Malcolm, on the other hand, was all about the people. Okay. So if you're going ahead and you're venerating Pookie, what are you doing? You're basically going ahead and you're trying to say, hey, these are attributes, or these are, you want to have that same selfishness that Pookie has. Get what I'm saying? Now, you might want to honor Pookie. You might want to remember, remember when Pookie went ahead, he was here, he did some things that was, comical and all that kind of stuff. You might want to honor him in that respect, but you don't want to venerate him. Okay. And the reason being is because, like I said, venerated ancestors, they're all about elevation. Venerated ancestors are all about elevating not just your consciousness, but they're also about elevating the consciousness of your ancestors, your ancestor spirits. Okay. This is what made me this understanding is what made me kind of finally leave the church. Okay. And the reason why is because I saw all these people that were getting filled with the Holy Ghost. But after the Spirit left them, they went right back to their, heathenistic behaviors. Okay. And that's when it kind of dawned on me after looking at this, that what they were really doing, the Holy Ghost, what they were really doing was actually, they were getting lower ancestral spirits. Okay, like Pookie. All right. So they were kind of, in a sense, they were venerating these lower ancestral spirits. All right. And that's the reason why there was no evolution. That's the reason why there was no growth, no spiritual growth. Okay. Now, like I said before, this is based upon my experience. This is based upon my cultural perspective. And I'm not saying all of this out of spite or anything. I'm not trying to, throw any shade on any, religion or whatever the case may be. But I want people to understand that there's a seriousness when it comes to actually dealing with your ancestors. You have to understand that if you're not growing, then what are you doing? Okay. And the same thing is, if you're not growing and you find yourself in the same situations, you find yourself getting back in that same predicament. Okay. That right there is basically a sign that you're dealing with some lower ancestral energy, okay, that needs to go ahead and need some light on it. Okay. Now, again, part of the reason why I can go ahead and I'm saying this, and I know that this happens based upon my experience, based upon my cultural perspective, is because those of you who follow, you follow my blog, if you've read my book, you know that I talk about how I discovered a cosmogram. Okay, and this cosmogram was based upon the Kongo-Angolan, dikenga, or Kongo Cross, and it also ties into the Kemetic thing. Okay, the Kemetic philosophy, Kemetic theology. All right. Now, I end up finding that or discovering that through my grandmother. Okay. My grandparents had a very, very strong Kongo-Angolan influence, like many Black people in the Mississippi Delta. Okay. So when they migrated up to Michigan and what have you, they brought that with them. Now, but I know that my grandmother didn't, she didn't study the Kemetic religion. My grandmother was a very devout Christian, but she didn't study the Kemetic religion. Okay. She didn't study anything about the Kemetic Way of Life or any of that kind of stuff. All right. So that basically helped me to understand how was I able to make this connection between the Kongo and the Kemetic Way of Life, or the Kongo and the Kemetic philosophy and theology and what have you. It was through a spirit guide. Okay. My grandmother basically served as the ancestral bridge that went ahead and got me over there, okay, that got me to connect to a spirit guide. All right. So that's how I know that, based upon my experience again, that's how I know that the spirit guides are the ones who are supposed to be venerated. Okay. So you need to understand the difference between honoring, venerating, and worshiping your ancestors. Okay. Again, if you just go ahead and you do things based upon it being a trend or whatever, you find yourself really falling out of flavor with that whole thing. Okay. Like I said, you can honor your ancestor, which is basically just remembering them. And one of the ways you can do that is just by making an offering. Okay. You can pour them a drink. You can give them some food. That's sufficient if you're just talking about just remembering them. Okay. But if you're going to venerate your ancestors, okay, if you're going to venerate them, then I would highly recommend that you read your history, read and study history. Okay. Don't just go by what people are telling you. Okay. Read and study history for yourself, because venerated ancestors, again, they deal with the upliftment of the people. Okay. They deal with the upliftment of not just you, but the entire, I would say almost the entire race. All right. And then once you go ahead and you do that, once you go ahead and you venerate them and what have you, okay, you want to engage in the worship. The worship is just basically to continue that practice, because it's not God who needs our prayers and our worship and all that and everything. Okay. It's, we need it. Okay. And the reason why we need it is mainly because we are creatures of habit. So we need to go ahead, we need to continue to remind ourselves of the virtues that are in our ancestral, that we find, that we hold in high regards, that we have respect for, virtues that we want to go ahead, virtues and attributes that we want to go ahead and we want it to include in our life, so that mirror in our life, I should say, so that we become better individuals. Okay, better individuals for ourselves, better individuals for our family, our loved ones, better individuals for our community. Okay, so I hope this helped you. If you have any questions or so, you want to go ahead, have suggestions, you want to drop me a line, feel free to do so. Okay, heads poo, peace and blessings. This is Derric RauKhu.